The desert has a memory. It remembers the sound of hooves pounding across dry earth, the echo of gunfire swallowed by canyon walls, and the groans of men whose lives ended beneath the wide western sky. In Bitter Creek, that memory was braided into a single length of hemp, tied in a knot that only one man's hands could make. Elias Carter, the hangman. He was not born to rope and timber. Once he was a soldier, a farm boy turned rifleman in the war between the states. But the war burned the softness out of him. When he came west, he brought with him a face like weathered oak and a silence that could chill a saloon full of gamblers. He wasn't quick with a gun, nor eager to spill blood in the dust of a duel. What he believed in was the rope. Clean, final, efficient. No stray bullets, no women caught in crossfire, no chance for an outlaw to fire back. To Elias, the noose was the closest thing to justice the frontier had ever known. The first time he strung a man up was not by law, but by necessity. It was in a mining camp near Red Rock, where fever for gold had drawn wolves in human skin. A drifter was caught with blood on his hands, a woman dead in his tent, and no sheriff for 50 miles. The miners wanted blood. The mob wanted fire. It was Elias who stepped forward, calm, steady, and said, "A rope will do." With nothing more than a cotton cord and the branch of a crooked cottonwood, the drifter swung as the desert sun fell. The men of that camp looked at Elias not with horror but with relief. He had given shape to their rage, turned chaos into ritual. Word spread. By the time Bitter Creek grew from a scattering of shacks into a town with a saloon, a church, and a single dusty main street, Elias Carter had become something more than a man. He was a figure the law could lean on, and outlaws learned to fear. When the new sheriff needed someone to carry out a hanging, he turned to Elias. And when the first gallows was raised on the edge of town, it was Elias's hand that tied the rope. 30 men would meet their end there. Horse thieves, claim jumpers, killers, even a boy of 19 who stabbed a card sharp in a drunken rage. Elias never shouted, never cursed, never mocked a man in his final moment. He read the charges, fixed the knot, and stepped back as the trap gave way. His face was stone. His voice, when he spoke, was low and without tremor. To some, he seemed merciful, offering a swift end instead of the bloody chaos of a lynching. To others, he was the cold hand of death itself, a man too eager to see bodies drop in the dawn light. In Bitter Creek, children grew up with the silhouette of Gallows against the horizon. Wives prayed their husbands would never fall into the hangman's path. Men lowered their voices when Elias walked into a saloon, for he carried the weight of justice on his shoulders, and that weight bent everyone around him. But justice in the West was a fickle thing. The law was often written not in ink, but in fear, in debts, in grudges settled behind closed doors. Some of the men Elias hanged had stolen horses in desperation, trying to feed a family. Some swore innocence with a rope already around their neck. And though Elias told himself the rope was cleaner than the gun, cleaner than the mob, the lines blurred with every creak of the scaffold. Still, he carried on. Perhaps he believed the work gave him purpose. Perhaps he thought the rope was a shield against the chaos of the frontier. Or perhaps, deep down, he knew what the townsfolk whispered behind his back, that no man could send 30 souls to their death without owing something to the devil himself. And so, with every knot tied, with every plank dropped, Elias Carter's legend grew. A legend built not on the gold of Bitter Creek, nor on the guns that blazed in its saloons, but on the rope that swung in silence beneath the desert sun. Every rope tells a story. The fibers fray with time, but they hold the memory of the weight they bore. In Bitter Creek, the gallows became more than wood and hemp. It was a ledger, each name written not on paper, but carved into the silence of dawn. 30 men, 30 fates, 30 stories cut short beneath Elias Carter's watchful eye. The first official hanging in Bitter Creek was a man named Clayton Rhodes, a horse thief caught trying to drive a stolen herd north under cover of night. The law in those days was clear and cruel. Horse stealing was as good as murder. A man without a horse in the desert was a man already dead. Rhodes pleaded for his life, swearing he'd been framed, swearing he'd only borrowed the animals for a night. But the sheriff read the warrant, Elias tied the knot, and by sunrise the herd had been returned to its owner, while Rhodes's boots dangled empty above the dust. His wife wailed at the foot of the gallows. The sound carried for miles. Then came others. John McBride, a gunslinger who shot a gambler in a saloon quarrel. Patrick Lowe, a miner accused of killing a partner over a claim dispute. Jesse Boyd, who slit a merchant's throat for less than $20. Each stood on the trapdoor, each faced Elias's steady hand, and each dropped into the same pitiless silence. Yet for every guilty man, there was another whose crime was less certain. There was Silas Young, the 19-year-old who knifed a card sharp during a drunken brawl. He wept openly as the noose was placed, begging for forgiveness, his mother screaming curses at the sheriff and the hangman alike. There was Thomas Avery, a farmer accused of burning his neighbor's barn, though no one had seen him strike the match. And there was Miguel Ortega, a drifter from the borderlands, who swore on his mother's grave he had never killed the rancher he was blamed for. His last words, spoken in Spanish, were never translated for the crowd. The townsfolk gathered each time, some with solemn faces, others with a morbid thirst. The gallows became theater. Mothers held their children back, but the children peeked anyway, eyes wide, watching the twitching legs, the silence after. A few brave boys even sneaked to the gallows at night, daring each other to touch the rope that still swayed in the wind. For Elias Carter, it was ritual. He ate no breakfast on hanging days. He drank no whiskey the night before. His hands were steady, his breath even, his voice calm as he read out the charges. Some prisoners spat in his face, some cursed him, swearing they'd haunt him till his dying day. Others broke down, sobbing, praying for mercy. Elias never answered their prayers, never met their eyes with more than a flicker of recognition. He was not the law, he would say, only its servant. But the words carried little weight when he was the last man a condemned soul ever saw. As the years passed, the town began to change. The railroad pushed westward, more settlers arrived, more money flowed through Bitter Creek. With progress came more crime, and with crime came more death on the gallows. Each execution added another stone to the wall of silence that grew around Elias Carter. The townsfolk avoided his gaze, even as they relied on his rope to keep order. In the saloon, his name was spoken in whispering whispers. To some, he was a necessary evil. To others, he was no better than the men he hanged. The widows, the orphans, the families left behind, they did not forget. They said the hangman's boots tracked blood no one else could see. They swore the sound of the trapdoor haunted their dreams. A few even claimed they saw the faces of the hanged reflected in Elias's cold eyes. 30 men, 30 ropes. 30 stories cut short, and with each one, Bitter Creek tightened the knot around Elias Carter's soul. For though the town was safer, and the law held firm, a question began to whisper beneath the surface. How long can a man live with the weight of 30 dead men on his shoulders, before the rope swings back for him? The gallows stood silent on the edge of town, but its shadow stretched into every corner of Bitter Creek, and nowhere did it loom heavier than inside the saloon. The Silver Spur was the only place in town where men could dull their nerves with whiskey and cards. Yet it became the very chamber where Elias Carter's legend twisted into something more than flesh and bone. At first, the talk was simple, men swapping stories over spilled whiskey. They'd recall the look on a prisoner's face before the trap fell, the way the rope snapped tight, the twitch of boots against the air. Men told these stories the way others told jokes, leaning into the details, laughing too loud, trying to make light of what they couldn't quite face in silence. But the more Elias worked, the more the talk shifted. Some gamblers swore they felt cold drafts in the saloon, even when the fire was hot and the doors were shut. A miner named Greeley said he'd seen the reflection of Jesse Boyd, the gambler who died on the gallows, staring back at him in his whiskey glass one night. Another man, half drunk and trembling, claimed he saw the boots of Clayton Rhodes, the horse thief, hanging from the rafters above the card table where he sat. He fled the town the next morning and never came back. The whispers spread like prairie fire. Soon, no one wanted to sit across the table from Elias Carter, not even to share a drink. They said his boots carried dust that wasn't from the street, but from the grave. They said when he laid his hand on a whiskey glass, the rim frosted like winter in the desert. One barmaid swore she saw him sitting in the corner without moving for hours, staring at nothing, his lips moving as if in silent prayer. or silent conversation with someone no one else could see. The sheriff tried to stamp it out, telling the townsfolk to stop speaking foolishness. The hangman does the Lord's work, he'd remind them. He keeps the peace, keeps this town alive. But the sheriff's own hands began to trembling whenever he signed another warrant. And when Elias walked into the Silver Spur, the piano went quiet, cards dropped onto the table, and men lifted their glasses with uneasy hands. By 1873, the stories grew darker. Drifters passing through claimed the gallows moaned at night when no wind stirred. Miners said they heard voices calling from the scaffold when they returned late from the canyon. One night, a group of ranch hands swore they saw 30 shadows swaying against the moonlight, though only one rope hung on the gallows beam. The saloon became the vessel of these tales. Each whisper passed with the weight of a curse, and with each telling, Elias Carter grew less like a man and more like something caught between life and death. A necessary figure, yes, but one who seemed to carry with him the company of the dead. Elias himself rarely entered the saloon anymore. He kept to himself, working his small farm on the outskirts of town, fixing fences, raising a mule or two. Yet when he did appear in the Silver Spur, silence fell heavy. He never touched whiskey, never played cards. He would sit, straight-backed, listening. To some, it felt like he was listening for more than men's voices, listening for those whispers only he could hear. There's a saying on the frontier, a man can only bury so many souls before he starts burying pieces of himself. By then, Elias Carter had buried 30. And the whispers in the saloon spoke of the same thing, over and over. Sooner or later, the rope would turn. The law in Bitter Creek was a thin rope itself, fragile, fraying, held together by a few men who stood between order and chaos. The sheriff, Matthew Rollins, had been there almost as long as Elias Carter, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel. Rollins believed in keeping things simple. Keep the miners working, keep the saloon running, keep the outlaws out. But in the Wild West, the law wasn't written in dusty books. It was written in deals, in debts, in whispers behind closed doors. Elias Carter had always told himself he was only the instrument, never the judge. The sheriff signed the warrants, the judge gave the sentence, and Elias carried it out. Yet as the years wore on, that pact grew heavy, twisted by the hunger of men who wanted more than justice. At first, it was easy enough. A horse thief here, a killer there. But soon the names became familiar. The banker wanted a debtor out of the way, and suddenly that debtor found himself on trial for arson. A rancher feuded with a drifter over water rights, and soon the drifter swung from Elias's rope. The judge grew old, his pockets filled with bribes, his pen scratching guilty as easily as signing his own name. And Sheriff Rollins, who once swore by law, began to look the other way when influential men nudged him toward the gallows. Elias tied the knots, pulled the levers, but the whispers began to gnaw at him. He could no longer tell if the men he hanged were guilty by God's truth or guilty only by convenience. And every time he heard the trapdoor snap, he felt the weight of more than the condemned. It was the weight of his own soul bending beneath the strain. One night, after the hanging of Thomas Avery, the farmer accused of burning a barn, Elias found Rollins waiting for him outside the gallows. The sheriff's face was pale, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette. "You ever wonder, Elias," he said, "what we're doing here?" Elias gave no answer. He only wiped his rope, coiled it with precision, and slung it over his shoulder. Rollins exhaled smoke into the night. "We're not lawmen anymore. We're cleaners. We wipe away the men others don't want to see. And one day, one of us is gonna end up on that rope." The words hung heavier than the desert air. Elias met the sheriff's eyes, and for the first time, Rollins looked afraid of the man he called friend. The pact between sheriff, judge, and hangman was no longer about justice. It had become survival. Each depended on the others to carry the burden of their deeds, to keep the town quiet, to keep their own names clear. And as the money flowed, as the whispers of corruption spread, Elias Carter stood at the center of it all. The silent hand that turned men into corpses while others grew fat on the illusion of order. But there is a cost when men trade their souls for stability. Bitter Creek became a place where fear replaced faith, where families whispered prayers not to God but against the gallows. Children grew up knowing the sheriff's badge meant power, not protection. And Elias, whose silence once gave him strength, now carried silence like a curse. Still, the rope never stopped swinging. The sheriff's pact held even as cracks formed in the wood of the gallows and in the hearts of the men who ordered its use. But as every cowboy knows, when a rope begins to fray, it never mends. It only waits for the moment it snaps. And for Elias Carter, that moment was drawing closer, with every whispered curse, with every innocent face etched into the back of his mind. Every legend has its fulcrum, the moment when the weight of the past tips forward and cannot be stopped. For Elias Carter, that moment came with the last prisoner ever to face his rope. The spring of 1874 was colder than usual, a biting wind sweeping through Bitter Creek, carrying with it the sense that something was about to break. The gallows stood creaking in the night like a weary sentinel, and for weeks it had remained unused. Then came the arrest that changed everything. His name was Samuel Holt, younger than most, no more than 25, with black hair that fell to his shoulders, and eyes that burned with a kind of fury Elias had not seen before. The charge was murder. Samuel was accused of shooting a ranch foreman in a quarrel over stolen cattle. The sheriff swore the evidence was clear, but the trial was swift, too swift, and when the gavel fell, the sentence was death by hanging. The night before the execution, Elias walked the perimeter of his small farm, rope coiled in his hands. He told himself it was like any other hanging, just another name, another body, another weight for the gallows. But something gnawed at him. Samuel Holt was no stranger. Elias knew the boy's face, though he had tried hard to forget it. Years earlier, before Bitter Creek, Elias had been a soldier. There had been a woman in Missouri, a woman who carried his child. Elias had left her behind, chasing the promise of land and freedom in the West. He had never looked back, until now. Samuel Holt was that child, grown into a man, standing in the jail with shackles on his wrists. Whether Samuel knew it or not, Elias could not say. The boy did not look at him with recognition, only with hatred. A hatred not born from family, but from the rope Elias carried. When dawn came, the town gathered as they always did. Mothers pulled children close. Men stood silent with hats in hand. Elias stood on the scaffold, rope in hand, his face carved from stone. Samuel was led up the steps, shoulders squared, voice unshaken. He stared straight ahead, not at the crowd, not at the sheriff, but at Elias. "You've killed innocent men," Samuel said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "And if there's any justice left in this land, you'll swing the same as me." The words were knives, cutting through the stillness. Some townsfolk shifted uneasily, others muttered prayers. Elias said nothing. His hands were steady as he tied the knot, but inside, the world trembled. He had hanged strangers, drifters, killers, thieves. But here, with Samuel Holt's breath warm against his cheek, Elias felt every soul he had condemned pressing against his shoulders. The sheriff read the sentence, his voice flat, his eyes avoiding Elias. Then came the moment. Elias stepped back, hand on the lever, heart hammering like a war drum. Samuel's words echoed, "You'll swing the same as me." And for the first time in all his years, Elias hesitated. The silence stretched. The crowd held its breath. Some swore later that the sky darkened, that the wind died, that time itself waited for the hangman to decide. Then, with a hand that shook just once, Elias pulled the lever. The trap fell, the rope snapped tight, and Samuel Holt's body swung in the morning light, his boots twitching against the air. The crowd dispersed in silence. No cheers, no curses, only a heavy dread that clung to the town like smoke. And Elias, who had tied 30 knots before, walked away with his rope in hand, his face pale, his eyes hollow. The boy's final words clung to him like a brand. By sundown, whispers were already rising. Some said Samuel Holt had cursed the hangman with his last breath. Others claimed Elias looked like a man already half dead, and a few swore they saw him talking to himself that night, as though speaking to the 31 souls he had sent into the void. The rope that had always been Elias Carter's tool of order had now become his burden. And within days, Bitter Creek would learn that a hangman cannot escape the noose forever. Bitter Creek woke to silence that morning, a silence so heavy even the sparrows refused to sing. The sun had not yet crested the ridges, and the streets lay in a gray half-light. It was the blacksmith, Tom Avery, who first saw the shape swaying in the dawn wind. At first, he thought it a rag or a shadow, but as he drew closer, the truth struck him like a bullet. There, upon the very gallows he had worked for years, hung Elias Carter, the hangman himself, dangling from his own rope. The town gathered quick, boots pounding against the boards, whispers spreading like wildfire. Mothers covered their children's eyes, men took off their hats and stood in uneasy reverence. No one could explain how it had happened. The sheriff swore he had locked the jail, and Elias was last seen walking home the night before. Yet here he was, limp and swaying, the hangman hanged. The rope was tied perfectly, as though done by Elias's own practiced hands. The knot rested against his neck with the same cruel precision he had granted 31 others. His boots hung still, his eyes closed, as though sleep had simply claimed him mid-step. Some claimed it was justice, Samuel Holt's curse fulfilled. The boy's last words, "You'll swing the same as me," were now burned into every whisper, every side glance. The townsfolk began speaking of the gallows as if it were alive, a hungry thing that demanded its price. But others swore Elias had not done it himself. The farmhands who lived near his homestead said they heard voices in the wind that night, voices that did not belong to any man. One woman, old Miss Abernathy, claimed she saw Elias walking toward the gallows long past midnight, his eyes empty, his steps slow, as though pulled forward by invisible hands. She swore she saw shadows moving with him, shadows shaped like the 31 who had swung before him. The sheriff, bound by duty, cut Elias down. They laid his body in the church, candles flickering over his hollow face. His rope, coiled neatly, was placed beside him. And though the town debated whether it was suicide or curse, one truth settled in every heart. Bitter Creek would never be the same. By sundown, the gallows stood abandoned, its timbers creaking with every gust. No one dared to climb its steps. The children who once snuck close on dares now crossed the street rather than pass it. And at night, some swore they could hear the boards groan, as if someone still walked them, heavy boots echoing in the dark. In death, Elias Carter became more than a man. He became a warning. A story whispered around campfires and saloons, told in hushed tones as the whiskey burned down throats. The tale of the hangman who could not escape his own noose. Some say his rope was cursed, that whoever touched it would feel the weight of every life it had claimed. Others swore they saw Elias still, wandering the outskirts of town, rope in hand, eyes searching for the next neck to fill it. The line between truth and legend blurred, as it always does in the West. But one thing remained certain, the gallows stood empty from that day on. No man in Bitter Creek dared raise another rope, and if justice was to be served, it would come by gun or exile, but never again by hanging. The West moved on, as it always did, but the story of Elias Carter clung like dust to the boots of every traveler. They called him the last hangman. And whenever dawn broke over an empty street, and the wind whistled through the timbers, some swore you could still see a figure swaying there, caught between this world and the next. Elias Carter had built his life on the rope. In the end, the rope took him back. And so, Bitter Creek was left with its silence, its ghosts, and the gallows that creaked in the dawn, forever waiting, though no man would climb it again.